Welcome to Karen Stories, where the wildest Karen encounters unfold. Get ready for hilarious, unbelievable, and shocking moments as Karens make the most outrageous demands. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss a crazy story. Let's dive in. Jamal had always dreamed of owning a home in a peaceful, upscale neighborhood, a place where he could finally enjoy the fruits of his relentless dedication. For years, he had poured every ounce of his energy into building his business, working late nights and sacrificing personal luxuries for the promise of a better future. And now, standing at the edge of his private pool, watching the rippling water shimmer under the golden afternoon sun, he finally felt like he had made it. This was his sanctuary, his personal slice of tranquility. But peace, as Jamal was quickly learning, was not something his neighbor Karen was willing to grant him. From the very first day he moved in, he had felt the weight of her eyes on him. Karen, the self-proclaimed gatekeeper of the neighborhood, had made it her personal mission to ensure that Jamal never forgot. He was an outsider. At first, it was subtle, the lingering stares from her porch as he carried boxes into his new home, the overly cheerful yet condescending way she spoke to him when she introduced herself, emphasizing certain words as if speaking to a child. "Oh, you're the new owner?" she had asked, her gaze sweeping over him like he was some kind of curiosity rather than a neighbor. How unexpected. Jamal had brushed it off. He was no stranger to veiled prejudice, and he wasn't about to let one nosy neighbor ruin the excitement of his new home. But the microaggressions quickly escalated. Karen's passive-aggressive comments became a near-daily ritual, thinly veiled insults, disguised as neighborly concerns. "You know, people around here take a lot of pride in their homes," she would say, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "It's important to keep up appearances. Wouldn't want the property values to drop, right?" Jamal knew exactly what she meant. He didn't belong, at least not in her eyes. But even then, he had refused to engage. He had worked too hard to let someone like Karen disrupt his life. Then came the pool. At first, it was just small, puzzling details. Wet footprints on the deck when he hadn't been outside. An empty wine glass left near the lounge chairs. A faint scent of perfume in the air. He convinced himself he was imagining things, until the day he caught her in the act. It was early one Sunday morning when Jamal stepped outside with his coffee, expecting to enjoy a quiet moment by the water. But instead, he found Karen sprawled on a lounge chair by his pool, sunglasses perched on her nose, sipping from a glass of rose as if she owned the place. For a moment, he was too stunned to speak. She hadn't just trespassed, she had made herself at home. "Excuse me, Karen, but this is my property," he finally said, his voice controlled but firm. Karen barely glanced at him, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, relax. It's just water." His jaw tightened. "You didn't ask for permission. This is trespassing." She finally turned to look at him then, an amused smirk playing on her lips. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she uttered words that made his stomach twist with rage. "You people don't own pools like this anyway. I'm doing you a favor." Jamal felt his blood run cold. He had faced racism before, but never this brazen, this entitled. He wanted to lash out, to drag her off his property, and make sure she never returned. But he knew better. Karen wasn't just a nuisance, she was a time bomb waiting to explode. And if he reacted the way she wanted him to, he would be the one paying the price. So instead, he took a deep breath and turned away, fists clenched at his sides. If she wanted to play games, she had no idea who she was up against. This wasn't over. The footprints were back. Jamal stood at the edge of his pool, staring at the damp imprints marring the sun-warmed tiles. They trailed from the water's edge to the patio, disappearing into the trimmed hedges that bordered his backyard. His stomach twisted. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had been here. Again. His grip tightened around the towel in his hands. He already knew who it was. Karen. It had started small, almost imperceptible. A misplaced chair. A faint scent of perfume clinging to the humid air. Then, one evening, he'd found an empty wine glass balanced on the edge of his pool, the deep red stain on the rim still fresh. That was the moment he knew Karen had been inside his yard, lounging by his pool as if she belonged there. Jamal tried to handle it civilly. He confronted her, keeping his voice steady, controlled. "Karen, I've noticed things around my pool, things that shouldn't be there. Have you been coming onto my property?" She had the audacity to laugh. "Oh, come on, Jamal. It's just a pool." No apology. No guilt. Just that smug, dismissive smirk that made his blood simmer. "It's my pool," he reminded her, his voice sharper this time. "You didn't ask. That's trespassing." Karen waved a hand, as if shooing away an annoying fly. "You need to lighten up. We're neighbors." What's a little shared space between friends? They weren't friends. And this wasn't shared space. This was his home. His sanctuary. He installed a gate the very next day. A sturdy, reinforced barrier with a heavy-duty lock. He thought that would be enough. Thought Karen would take the hint. He was wrong. Days later, Jamal caught her again this time. Scaling the fence like a petty thief. Gripping the metal bars with the determination of someone who believed rules simply didn't apply to them. He watched, fists clenched, as she dropped into his backyard, dusted herself off, and sauntered toward the water like she had every right to be there. This time, he didn't wait. Karen. His voice was a sharp crack against the quiet afternoon. She flinched but quickly recovered, turning toward him with a slow, lazy grin. Oh, hey Jamal. Didn't see you there. Jamal stalked forward, every muscle in his body coiled tight. What the hell do you think you're doing? Karen sighed, exasperated, as if he were the unreasonable one. Relax. It's just a pool. You broke in, he snapped. You climbed my fence. You're trespassing. She rolled her eyes. God, you're so dramatic. It's not like I'm stealing anything. Jamal took a step closer, towering over her, his patience rapidly eroding. You need to leave. Now. She held his gaze for a moment. Something dark and calculating flickering behind her smirk. Then, with a slow shrug, she grabbed her towel and strutted toward the gate. Fine. But you really should be more neighborly, Jamal. That was the moment he realized she wasn't going to stop. She wanted to push him. She wanted a reaction. And if he wasn't careful, she'd get exactly what she wanted, a reason to paint him as the angry black man. A menace to the neighborhood. So he did what he always did. He took the high road. He installed security cameras. Called the homeowners association. Reported her behavior to the authorities. He followed every legal step, playing by the rules. But Karen wasn't playing by the rules. She upped the ante, spinning a narrative to the neighbors that made her sound like the victim. Jamal is just being difficult, she would say, shaking her head dramatically. I thought we were friends, but he's being so territorial. She even went to the HOA, lodging complaints against him. I just think his presence is changing the neighborhood, she had said, her voice dripping with false concern. I mean, I don't want to say anything bad, but, well, property values matter. Jamal clenched his jaw when he heard that. He knew exactly what she meant. And then, the final straw. He came home one evening to find his backyard trashed. Empty liquor bottles floating in the pool. Cigarette butts crushed into the patio. The sharp stench of stale alcohol clung to the air. The pool chairs were overturned, the cushions slashed. His space, his home, had been violated. Again. Jamal stood frozen, staring at the wreckage. His pulse thundered in his ears. He knew who was responsible. Karen. This wasn't just entitlement anymore. This wasn't just petty trespassing. This was war. Jamal stood at the edge of the chaos that had once been his peaceful backyard. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The smell of stale alcohol hung thick in the air, mixing with the chlorine from his now polluted pool. Empty liquor bottles bobbed lazily on the water's surface, their labels peeling from where they had soaked overnight. His poolside chairs were overturned, some cushions slashed open as if someone had taken a knife to them in a fit of drunken rage. Cigarette butts and discarded food wrappers littered the patio. His sanctuary was gone. Violated. Defiled. And he knew exactly who had done it. Karen. Jamal's jaw tightened as he took a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to march to her house, to confront her, to make her understand that this wasn't just a prank, wasn't just a bit of fun. But he knew better. He knew how this would play out if he reacted with the anger she was trying to provoke. She wanted him to lose control. She wanted him to snap. Because the second he did, she would twist the narrative. He could already hear the words forming in her mouth, see the crocodile tears glistening in her eyes as she called the police. He threatened me. I was terrified. I thought he was going to hurt me. And in this world, her words would always weigh more than his truth. No. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. Instead, Jamal pulled out his phone, his hands steady despite the fury coiling in his chest, and methodically documented everything. Every bottle, every cigarette butt, every shredded cushion. He walked the perimeter of his property, capturing footage from every angle. When he was done, he went inside and pulled up the security footage from the night before. And there it was. Karen. Not just Karen, and a group of her equally entitled friends, laughing, drinking, dancing, splashing in his pool like they owned it. Like he didn't exist. Like his home was nothing more than their playground. Jamal felt his stomach twist as he watched her lounge in his chair, swirling a glass of wine in her hand as she gestured wildly to her guests. He could practically hear her condescending laugh. The same one she always used when she spoke to him. Like he was nothing. Like he was beneath her. She hadn't just disrespected his property. She had disrespected him. Fine, Jamal thought, his jaw setting into a determined line. She wanted a game, he'd play. First, he called the police. He wasn't naive, he knew that a simple trespassing complaint wouldn't lead to her arrest. Not when the system was designed to protect people like her. But that wasn't the point. The point was to make it official. To ensure there was a record of her actions. If she ever tried this again, there would be proof that she wasn't just some innocent neighbor caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Next, he contacted the homeowners association. He knew Karen had influence there. Knew she had spent years weaving herself into the fabric of the community. But even she couldn't argue with cold, hard evidence. He sent them the footage, along with a formal complaint outlining every instance of trespassing, harassment, and property damage she had inflicted upon him. And then, finally, he called his lawyer. Because if Karen thought she could violate his home, damage his property, and walk away without consequence, she was sorely mistaken. By the time he was done making calls, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across his ruined backyard. Jamal exhaled slowly, the tight coil of anger in his chest finally beginning to loosen. Karen had spent weeks pushing him, testing his limits, waiting for him to explode. She had underestimated him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jamal had always believed in handling things the right way. He had played by the rules, followed the proper channels, and given Karen every opportunity to stop before things escalated. But Karen didn't believe in rules, at least, not when they applied to her. She had violated his home, mocked his boundaries, and disrespected him in a way that could not go unanswered. The authorities had shrugged. The HOA had hesitated. The legal process was slow, tangled in red tape. But Jamal was done waiting. If Karen refused to learn through reason, then it was time for her to learn through fear. And he knew exactly what would make her afraid. Karen had a weakness, one she had made abundantly clear over the years. Snakes. Jamal had overheard her more than once at neighborhood gatherings, complaining about how even a simple garden snake in her yard sent her into a blind panic. He had seen the way she recoiled at the sight of a harmless plastic snake at a community yard sale, clutching her chest as if she'd had a near-death experience. Fear. Pure, uncontrollable fear. That's when the idea took root in his mind. A plan that wouldn't hurt her, but would make her think twice before ever setting foot in his yard again. A plan that would leave her shaken, humiliated, and fully aware that she was no longer in control. Jamal spent the next few days preparing. He visited a local exotic pet shop, and found exactly what he was looking for: a non-venomous water snake. Small, harmless, but strikingly real in appearance, its sinuous body moved through water with an eerie grace. It was perfect. That night, under the cover of darkness, Jamal placed the snake into his pool, letting it glide silently beneath the moonlight. He adjusted his security cameras to capture every angle, ensuring he wouldn't miss a second of Karen's inevitable meltdown. And then, he waited. The next morning, just as he had predicted, Karen came slinking through the side of his property, her entitled arrogance practically radiating off her as she wriggled her way through the hedge gap she had so often used to trespass. She didn't even hesitate. The audacity, the sheer nerve. Jamal stood just inside his kitchen, watching through the window, his coffee warm in his hands, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. Karen, completely oblivious, tossed her towel onto a chair, kicked off her shoes, and stepped onto the pool deck, as if she belonged there. Without so much as a second glance, she dipped her toes into the cool water before sliding in completely, sighing in contentment. For a moment, it was almost peaceful. Then she saw it. A single ripple. A dark shape beneath the surface. Her body stiffened. And then, just as the snake moved slightly closer, she screamed. A blood-curdling, gut-wrenching scream that shattered the quiet morning air. Karen's entire body convulsed as she flailed wildly, sending waves crashing against the pool's edges. Her hands clawed desperately at the water, her legs thrashing in a blind panic. She tried to scramble for the pool's edge, her feet slipping against the wet tile, her nails scraping against the concrete. She was trapped. Jamal took a slow sip of his coffee, watching in quiet amusement as Karen's shrieks reached a fever pitch. She was gasping, splashing, begging for someone to help her. And then finally she managed to pull herself up the steps, tumbling onto the patio like a drowned rat, her breath coming in frantic gasps. Soaked, trembling, humiliated. That's when Jamal stepped outside, calm as ever. "Didn't know you had a pool pass, Karen," he said casually, leaning against the doorframe. His voice was light, conversational, as if she hadn't just been fighting for her life against a completely harmless creature. Her eyes snapped up to him, blazing with fury and humiliation. "You did this," she shrieked, her voice cracking. Jamal tilted his head. Did what? Secure my property? Keep out trespassers? He shrugged. Can't be mad at me for that. Karen's face turned beet red, her chest still heaving. I'm going to make you regret this, she spat, pointing a shaking finger at him. Jamal just smiled. I think you already do. Karen stormed off, dripping wet, her dignity trailing behind her like a discarded towel. And Jamal? He simply turned back inside, the sound of her terror still echoing in his ears. That was checkmate. And the best part? He had it all on camera. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, the air crisp and still. Jamal sipped his coffee from the porch, waiting. He had a feeling today was going to be interesting. Sure enough, right on schedule, she appeared. Karen moved with her usual self-assured arrogance, her robe tied loosely at the waist, a towel slung over her shoulder. She glanced around briefly, her sharp eyes scanning for any witnesses, before slipping through the small gap in the hedge. Just as she had done countless times before, the locked gate didn't stop her. The repeated warnings didn't stop her, because in her mind, she was untouchable. She belonged here. Jamal watched from the shadows of his doorway, his lips curling into a smirk as she approached the pool. She didn't hesitate. No cautious glances, no moment of doubt. Just the same entitled confidence that had fueled her trespassing from the beginning. She kicked off her slippers, draped her towel over a chair, and stepped forward. The water shimmered, inviting and undisturbed. She dipped her toes in, humming to herself as she waded deeper, the cool water enveloping her calves. Then her waist. And then she saw it. A dark shape slithered just beneath the surface. Karen froze. For a moment, she thought it was a shadow, just a trick of the light. But then it moved, her breath hitched. Her entire body went rigid. The sleek, sinuous form coiled lazily through the water, its head breaking the surface for just a second before disappearing again. And then, all hell broke loose. A scream shattered the peaceful morning, high-pitched and ear-splitting. Birds scattered from the trees as Karen's shriek echoed through the neighborhood. Her arms flailed wildly, sending waves splashing against the pool's edge. Her legs kicked furiously, but in her panic, she only managed to slip, plunging fully into the water. Another scream garbled, frantic bubbled up as she scrambled, gasping for air, her movements erratic, uncoordinated. Jamal casually stepped outside, coffee in hand. Morning, Karen, he called out, his voice laced with amusement. Nice day for a swim? Karen's head snapped up, eyes wide, dripping with terror. She pointed a trembling finger at the water, her voice breaking. Snake. There's a snake in the pool. Jamal feigned surprise, setting his coffee down as he took a step closer. Oh? A snake? You don't say. Karen was beyond rational thought now. She thrashed desperately toward the steps, her fingers clawing at the slick tile. But in her blind panic, she slipped again, her body twisting awkwardly as she landed back in the water with a splash. Jamal bit his lip, barely holding back his laughter. The snake, harmless, non-venomous, and completely uninterested in the flailing intruder, drifted serenely on the water's surface, utterly oblivious to the chaos it had caused. With one final, frantic push, Karen managed to haul herself out of the pool. She staggered onto the deck, soaking wet, her robe clinging to her like a second skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes darting wildly from Jamal to the water. You did this. She spat, her voice hoarse with fury. Jamal raised an eyebrow, arms crossed. Did what? Lock my gate. Secure my property? Expect people to respect boundaries? Karen's face burned red, whether from rage or embarrassment, he couldn't tell. She stood there, dripping, humiliated, trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. This isn't over, she snarled. Jamal simply took another sip of his coffee. Oh, I know. But as Karen stormed off, her wet footprints trailing across his patio, Jamal knew one thing for certain. She would never set foot in his pool again. Karen's downfall didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing collapse, one that she never saw coming until it was too late. The morning after the snake incident, she stormed into the HOA office, still fuming, her hair a tangled mess, the humiliation from her panic-stricken retreat still fresh in her mind. She demanded action. That man is a menace. He put a snake in his pool to attack me. Do you understand how dangerous that is? He needs to be removed from this neighborhood. The HOA members exchanged glances, unimpressed. One of them cleared his throat. Karen, we've actually been meaning to speak with you. There have been multiple complaints against you. Karen's face twisted in confusion. Me? You can't be serious. I'm the victim here. But the complaints had piled up. Jamal had made sure of that. Every piece of evidence, every report of her trespassing, her harassment, Her blatant disregard for property laws, it was all laid out before her. Undeniable and damning. The security footage was the final nail in the coffin. There she was, sneaking into Jamal's yard, hosting an unauthorized party, damaging his property. She had left a trail of entitlement and destruction, and now, it had finally caught up to her. Effective immediately. You're being fined for repeated trespassing and violation of community rules, one of the board members stated. You're also being reported to law enforcement for unlawful entry. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had spent years manipulating this very HOA, bending them to her will, making sure they saw her as the pillar of the neighborhood. But now, she was nothing more than a liability. And then came the final blow. Jamal, who had remained calm through it all, filed a lawsuit against her. Property damage, emotional distress, unauthorized use of private property. The charges stacked up against her like a house of cards ready to crumble. And crumble, they did. The case gained traction. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye to her antics suddenly weren't so eager to defend her. The support she thought she had evaporated. But it got worse. The house Karen lived in? It wasn't even hers. The landlord, who had been unaware of her illegal subletting, was less than pleased when the truth surfaced. Not only had Karen been violating the terms of her lease, but she had also dragged the property's name through the mud with her behavior. When the eviction notice arrived, Karen went into full meltdown mode, screaming about legal action. Threats that held no weight. But it was done. Within a month, she was gone. Jamal watched the moving truck from his porch, the same coffee cup in hand, the same patient smirk on his lips. Karen stood beside the curb, shouting into her phone, her hair unkempt, her face pale with stress. She caught sight of him, her eyes burning with resentment. He simply raised his cup in a silent toast. No more Karen. Peace had finally returned. And it had never tasted so sweet. The silence was the first thing Jamal noticed. For weeks, his home had been a battlefield, a place where he had been forced to fight for the respect and privacy he should have never had to defend in the first place. But now, there was nothing but the soft rustling of the wind through the trees, the gentle lapping of water in his pool, the distant hum of suburban life, moving on without the constant presence of chaos. Karen was gone. Jamal stood at the edge of his backyard, inhaling deeply, letting the crisp morning air fill his lungs. The sun cast golden streaks across the pristine blue water of his pool untouched, undisturbed. He had won. The satisfaction wasn't just in Karen's departure. It wasn't even in the fact that she had been humiliated, fined, sued, and ultimately evicted. No, the real victory was in reclaiming his own space, his own peace. She had tried to push him out, to make him feel like an outsider, to make him doubt his own belonging. But in the end, she was the one who had been cast out. The neighborhood had moved on quickly. No one really spoke of Karen anymore, at least not openly. People nodded at Jamal now, a silent acknowledgement that they had been watching, that they had seen how everything unfolded. Some still carried guilt, others just relief that the storm had passed. But Jamal didn't need their validation. He had never needed it. He took another sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth, the taste of quiet triumph. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, Karen, disheveled, hollow-eyed, walking aimlessly down the sidewalk, her once perfect blonde bob unkempt, her expensive clothes now wrinkled and dull. Her fall from grace had been swift and merciless. She caught sight of him and froze, her face twisting into something unreadable: anger, shame, regret, maybe all of them at once. Jamal simply smiled, turning his gaze toward the brand new sign hanging on his locked gate. Private property. Trespassers will be snaked. A sharp inhale. A flicker of rage. But she said nothing. She just turned and walked away, shoulders hunched, her defeat absolute. Jamal watched her go, then leaned back against his chair, stretching out under the warmth of the sun. Peace had never felt so good.